All right, welcome back, everyone, and happy Sunday. This is Saint Richards Episcopal School. While the judges, when you were out, we were having a nice little chat there about the students and their accoutrement that they've got there on their lapel pins. And also, we know a little bit more about who Saint Richards is. It was a nice conversation, or Saint Richards was, I guess I should say. But anyway, we're bringing you all back. I'm still Mark McCauley, your facilitator and timekeeper from yesterday. And if it's okay with you, we'll stick with the timing indicators we had. We had a green background for 1 minute left, and we had a yellow background for when your time is up at 4 minutes and 8 minutes. And other than that, I'm going to mute and turn it over to the judges.
Welcome back, and thank you. So excited to be with you today. And thank you to your teacher who made all of this happen. My name's Rebecca Tinder. I'm a retired attorney from Charleston, West Virginia, and the West Virginia We the People coordinator. Lindsay?
My name is Lindsay Draper. I am currently Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the Institute for Wellbeing in Law.
You're muted.
Hi again, everybody. I'll get that down by tomorrow, probably, I hope. I'm Candida Steele, and I'm still retired from the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, and very glad to see you all here.
And you all are?
I am Malcolm Hembry.
I am Richard Morris.
I am Mary Jane Firkwin.
And our teacher is Mrs. Neal.
Thank you. By process of elimination, we're doing question 2, which I will read. Political and social movements in American history have been successful because of the right of assembly. President Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter that, quote, the right of peaceable assembly, end quote, is part of the, quote, constitutional substitute for revolution, end quote. Do you agree or disagree with President Lincoln? Why? What is the history of freedom of assembly in America? What historical or contemporary evidence is there, if any, that political and social movements have led to significant changes in laws or policies? What limits, if any, should be placed on the right of freedom of assembly? You may begin.
The right to assemble plays a key role in our society. Allowing voices to be heard and opinions shared, one goal of rallies, parades, and protests is to get the government to change its policies on issues ranging from labor laws to civil rights to police brutality. Of course, the right to assembly is not absolute and has been defined and limited by the Supreme Court.
In 1869, in United States versus Cruikshank, the court exempted states from recognizing the protections of the First Amendment. Since that time, the majority of court rulings have set boundaries or strengthened the right to assembly. In 1937, the court reversed itself and said that the 14th Amendment required states to recognize and enforce the Assembly Clause. This case, DeJohn v. Oregon, involved a meeting of the Communist Party attended by close to 300 people, which had been shut down by local police. In Cox v. New Hampshire, the Supreme Court allowed time, place, and manner restrictions. In Hague v. CIO and Shuttlesworth v. Birmingham, the court struck down local government policies restricting assembly in public places.
American history is defined by political movements that have drawn the attention of the public and led to reform in laws and policies. This tradition dates back to the very beginning of the Republic, when citizens gathered in Boston and Philadelphia to protest taxation without representation. In the 19th century, abolitionism became a primary force that led to the Civil War and emancipation of enslaved persons. Public gatherings at places like Seneca Falls rallied women to the cause of equal suffrage. In the 20th century, underpaid employees held protests and started labor strikes in hopes of accomplishing better work hours and higher paychecks. Such protests led to the passage of fair labor laws.
Political and social change include the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and the Black Lives Matter protest movement today. Peaceful protests led by leaders such as Martin Luther King and John Lewis have led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. After the killing of George Floyd last summer, protests broke out all around the nation. In Minnesota, where the killing took place, the government agreed to shift money from policing to a wide range of social and mental health services. The death of Breonna Taylor, a victim of police brutality, inspired more protests and a passage of laws in some states and cities forbidding the issuing of no-knock warrants. These examples show that freedom of assembly plays a crucial role in perfecting the Constitution and expanding the power people have in government.
The First Amendment is specific, saying the right of the people to peacefully assemble should not be infringed. This does not mean that violent gatherings, such as the Capitol riot, are allowed. In 2017, protests in Los Angeles over the Rodney King beating became a 5-day riot that left 50 dead and $1 billion in property damage. The kind of destruction is not protected by the First Amendment. Time, place, and manner restrictions, applied without bias as to subject matter, are appropriate. Protests should not take place at night when people are sleeping or in the middle of a busy intersection. It is proper to require permits for rallies and parades as allowed by Cox v. New Hampshire. As the court noted, regulation of the use of streets for parades and processions is a traditional exercise of control by local government. This ensures people's rights will not be infringed while keeping order and stability.
President Lincoln was right in telling Alexander Stephens that the right to peaceably assemble is part of the constitutional right, substitute for revolution. However, it is just one part. Simply being able to gather and petition the government may not fully bring about constitutional revolution. The other two parts of the constitutional substitute are the ability to amend the Constitution and the right to vote.
You're muted, Rebecca.
You mentioned DeJong versus Oregon in your prepared remarks. In that Supreme Court case, the court held that the freedom of assembly was as important as the freedom of speech. Do you agree or disagree with that statement, and why?
I agree with that statement. Because freedom of speech is being able to say whatever you want to say, but it doesn't really have as much of an effect if you can't be seen saying that. Freedom of assembly is the ability to be able to be seen in big movements, saying what you want to say, utilizing the right to freedom of speech.
But can't just everybody say what they wanted to say? And why do they have to get together? They could send in petitions or.
I think that if you're at an assembly, it draws more attention to the issue because you can put there's numbers and words. So if you really want to get the government's attention, it's by having more people and by having a group of people who believe the same thing and want the same thing, you're more likely to get the government's attention and get the result that you want because numbers help that.
So you emphasized the time, place, and manner restrictions, and you said that, protests shouldn't take place at night. So I and all my friends have to be at work. And, I can't walk around during the day. I need to be able to protest after 5:30. Am I excluded?
You are not excluded. The time, place, and manner restrictions would not apply. In that case, there are certain restrictions to those. Like it's not just going to be after 5:30. It's going to be while people are sleeping. You're not disrupting people if you're just protesting after 5:30. It's like when you're protesting at 11 o'clock at night, that's when you're going to be disrupting people. And then you can also go and protest on the weekends during the daytime when you have time off.
Not if you're in this program.
Okay, thank you.
That was, I like that start. And so speaking of newer protests, and do you think police action in police responses to protests lately, what do you think of police response?
I think that, so with in the past, the police have used dogs or water to try to control the protests. And I think that that kind of behavior from the police isn't necessarily acceptable nowadays because laws have been changed and kind of people have been more kind of accepting to who people are. And I think that it's not appropriate that that's happening and kind of what's been happening nowadays with the police. I think that they should treat people kind of with more respect. And I understand that riots are different circumstances because they're not, they weren't like, you didn't have a permit or a warrant from the police or from the government or a judge. And that's a little different. But I think that with the protests that have been happening and kind of the police's response is unacceptable.
Do you think that's changing? Do you think the governments are responding to the police reactions to protests?
I think the police, I think the government is responding to is trying to take down police responses to protests. So like pacify them a bit more. But that sometimes can lead to, like the Capitol riot, where there was not enough security at the US Capitol to prevent it from being stormed when the protest turned into a riot.
I would also say one of the differences between the Capitol riot and the like Black Lives Matter protests, for an example, is I believe the Black Lives Matter protests might have enraged police officers more because the Black Lives Matter protesters, part of what they were protesting against was police responses, and that was not at all the same thing that the Capitol rioters were fighting.
I also want to mention that, well, maybe it's a little different, but the police are taking more steps to ensure kind of the safety and like the equality of people with, like I mentioned in the speech, how no-knock warrants are being banned in different states and different different states. And so I think that yes, the police is responding to what people have been protesting about, and they're trying to move forward. And
Okay, we focused a lot on the law enforcement response to assemblies or violence during assemblies. What about the assemblies themselves? Should there be any more limits placed on the assemblies to make sure that they stay peaceful?
I think that right now there are quite a few restrictions on freedom of assembly, and I think right now that those restrictions are keeping assemblies pretty peaceful and not disturbing. So like they don't take place at night, like we said, or anything else that might disturb other people. So I think that right now, all of the restrictions are just a pretty good place on the freedom of assembly.
Though I do think there could be more restrictions, like the Capitol riot that took place in broad daylight. There was fighting at the Capitol in the heart of our democracy in broad daylight, and that was not restricted as it should have been.
And what should have been done that was not?
There should have been more thought put into like what those people would have done when they're coming from these protests around the city to the Capitol. There should have been more consideration put into that, and when you're giving permits and things like that.
Are you suggesting that their movement should have been limited?
Yes, like when they're they should not have been allowed to come from different protests around the city to one, like all into one spot.
Great job. We had more to talk about, didn't we? That's always a sign of a good presentation. Again, good job. You mentioned the Dijon case in your opening, which was a case that I already had on my list to ask you about. So we're on the same wavelength there. You took us all the way back to 1869 before bringing us forward to Black Lives Matter and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. So you really covered a lot of material in your opening remarks. And then we got an opportunity to dive deeper in the question and answers, things that we're struggling with right now as to how to keep them peaceful. We understand the difference between peaceful assemblies and what you term as riots, which I assume means that they're not acting peacefully, and that you've recognized that social change is occurring as a result of activities of assembly and speech, and that maybe more could be done. And I think that's a great conversation. I hope you continue that conversation for a long time into your senior years as you travel through your educational process and beyond. Great job.
Thank you.
One of the things that I walk away from a number of these hearings with is an incredible sense of optimism. And I have to tell you all, you have left me feeling as good as any group that I have listened to in the course of the last couple of days. I just need to say that to you. A couple of things you did. I want to say, first of all, most people have talked about the civil rights era, and I have heard quite a bit about Martin Luther King. John Lewis's name came up for the first time in your presentation. That was not a small thing for me. You talked about changes. You reminded me of something that I don't talk about with young people, that I tend to talk about with teachers. And that is the technology has had a lot to do with some stuff. When I was your age, and there were these group freedom riders who went through the South, and their buses got burned. Well, for the most part, issues of racial discrimination didn't say squat to Mr. and Mrs. Montana or Mr. and Mrs. South Dakota. They didn't know anything about that, but they did ride Greyhound. They did ride trailways to get from Missoula to Helena. And when they saw a bus burned up on the news, television took some stuff and personalized it. Well, you can have every Black person in the world talk about how they get treated by the police. But when folks look at somebody on somebody's neck for 9 minutes, that can't be forgotten. So there are a huge bunch of these things that the change in technology has a lot to do with. But what was so cool listening to you all was the optimism that you expressed in you all do see that we're getting better. And that's how you all look at things. And I can't tell you how good I felt as I finished listening to your presentation. I'll be quiet for a while, but doggone it, you all did a good job. Thanks.
Thank you.
I agree. It was a really lovely job. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. You brought up things that we hadn't heard before, and U.S. versus Crookshank was really nice, and the 14th Amendment in Shuttlesworth, and the Seneca Falls, and labor strikes and fair labor laws was a really good point to make. And then you certainly covered civil rights and the BLM and George Floyd's killing, and even talking about defunding the police department, and No Knock with Breonna, and bringing up John Lewis was wonderful. I thought you did a really nice job talking about the Capitol riot as well. One thing I think was interesting, I don't know whether you realized, but I think there were no permits granted for anybody to go to the Capitol. They were simply to gather around the White House and listen to Trump. So that was bringing up the permits was also a really good point. And I think I liked better than anything the fact that you all said that Lincoln was writing to Stevens. None of us knew. I mean, it didn't occur to me to find out who was he writing to, but thank you for telling us. That was very important. And I think you just did a really lovely, thorough job of understanding what you were supposed to be looking at here. And that's going to stand you in really good stead the rest of your life. If you put as much effort into the rest of the things that you engage yourself in the future, boy, are you going to be sterling kids. It's going to be really lovely to hear about all of you. Thank you. That was a really terrific job.
Thank you, and thank you all for putting this weekend to work with us.
Thank you. I didn't mean to be clapping over you. Sorry, Mark.
No, that was Malcolm, actually. Malcolm, what were you?
Malcolm, I'm sorry.
I was just saying thank you for taking this time on a weekend to work with us. And
oh, it's our pleasure. Absolutely our pleasure. Thank you.
So now let's congratulate the team again. Thank you so much. Team Hart, for your hard work, and Mrs. Neal, thank you for your support and your direction for your students as well. All right, enjoy the rest of your Sunday and good luck.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.